we're back with Bobby Herrera of Populist Group, and we were just talking about Bobby's story telling and all of the different organizations he supports in terms of speaking, including children. I didn't know that part of your story, that you actually go to school. So how do you identify? You mentioned you like to share your story with kids from the wrong side of the track, or that don't have the advantage, and so you've identified school districts or areas in the nation that you just go talk to those kids.
Sure. So kids born on the wrong side of the opportunity divide, right?
Right.
I call them students of struggle, because these kids are getting so many gifts that they've yet to realize. And I've worked very hard to be intentional to tell them my stories and my struggles and the gifts that I pulled from those lessons and how I applied them to future challenges. And I just tell them real stories that I experienced. And you can see their eyes just get big, because they're finally realizing, like, wow, this could be part of the plan. Maybe struggle's preparing me for something.
That's awesome.
And it's a really wonderful, unique opportunity for me to connect with them. And to answer your question directly, though, my company's national, so I have locations in Detroit, Chicago, San Francisco, Seattle, and a couple other small locations, but we do work on a national level. And we support these kids organizations across the country. So sometimes different markets where there's a need, and we're real selective about where we support these two areas of our purpose for the company.
Right. And so we did talk a little bit about your company, about what you do, and let's dive a little bit into the book.
Yeah,
so the purpose
absolutely.
of the book, and the book's going to be released in Amazon.com June 3rd.
June 3rd.
I've pre-ordered
Thank you.
For my staff. I know it's going to be a good read. So tell me about the book a little bit. What can readers expect?
Sure. Well, first of all, writing a book wasn't on my list.
Right.
And
that's why I asked, because a lot of
yes.
times it's accidental journey, but a good journey.
Sure. Well, the primary essence of the book is we all struggle. Every struggle teaches us something. That's the gift. Leadership is sharing those gifts. So it's a book on leadership, and I've written a series of stories, life-changing lessons that help me become the leader that I imagine. And so my hope is simple. I hope that by me sharing my struggles and the gifts that I learned from those struggles and how I shared them, inspire others to do the same. Carmen, I just believe that the need for compassionate leadership has never been greater.
I love that, compassionate leadership. Talk about that a little bit. What do you mean by compassionate leadership?
When I think about leadership, in my mind, in my very strong opinion, there's only one way to lead, and that's with your heart and with your head. And so for me, that's an and, not an or. And often in business, I see the head win over the heart in that court of compassion. And I see it differently. I see that they can both be very well aligned in those decisions of leadership. And I have a chapter in the book called Choose the Hardest Right, about a lesson that I learned that forever changed my life and how I view leading with my heart. It's a story about my dad and a very challenging time that I was going through with my dad and the struggle and how it played out in the business as I was growing my company. And I'll never forget some of those lessons. And my hope is that by sharing these, it helps other great people take control of their story so that they can become the leader that they imagine. Because it's a journey. It's not a destination, it's a journey. It's an infinite game that we're playing. in becoming the leader that we imagine.
Definitely. Can you, I like that idea of the heart and the head connection. Can you give an example of both? When you do the head but don't have the heart connection, and then when you do both is obvious, but just when you don't have the heart connection.
Sure. Well, I'll do that by sharing a mistake that I made.
Okay.
Right. So often in business, we get overwhelmed with a lot of these strategic parts of the business, right? Like the strategy and the business and the marketing and the technology, all the sexy stuff, right? And that's a very comfortable place for entrepreneurs to migrate towards, which is why when you go to these conferences, these networking events, like what's the question, what's the most dominant question that you hear people ask when you go to a networking event?
Where's the opportunity?
Or what do you do, right?
Okay, what do you do?
Right? And if you recall at the beginning, I started with, why we exist, and then how you behave. Like, what you do is important, but it pales in comparison to why you do it. And the reason that's so important is the single most important asset that you will ever own as a leader or as a business owner is trust. Right? The more trust you have, the faster you can move and the less things cost. The less trust, the slower you move and the more things cost. It's very logical, but in order to build that trust, you have to focus on intentionally building it. And in order to do that, you have to lead with your heart. You have to have vulnerable, real conversations with people. You have to raise your hand and say, hey, I really messed this up. You have to ask for help. And a lot of entrepreneurs struggle with that. So to lead with your heart requires you to do those things that build trust. When you lead with your head and your head only, it's easy to hide in the book stuff, in those comfortable conversations. You have to have real uncomfortable conversations to build trust. Every relationship that we have that we value is based on trust.
So do you think that being very vulnerable with your employees helps, or to build that trust? I mean, I'm sure there'll be, certain limits to that, but just like you said, a little bit ago, you said just raising your hand when you need help. Like as the leader, some people might be too proud to say, hey, guys, I'm gonna need your help. I don't know what to do here. Okay, bring in core team people that you're asking them for help, and you're the leader of the company. Is that something, am I visualizing it correctly?
You've seen it 100 times, Carmen.
Okay.
Like, I bought into the dogma that I had to have all the answers, that I couldn't show my weaknesses, that I always had to have my stuff together. That's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Like, nobody does. And you know what's interesting though?
Yeah.
Is when I was on the other side of the table, when I was working for that boss, I always knew when they didn't have their stuff together. I could see right through that nonsense. And somehow when we become the leader, we think that no one can see it.
Right.
It's ridiculous. Right? So you absolutely have to have those conversations about what you're afraid of and what scares you and what frustrates you. If you don't, it's impossible to build trust. If you just focus on the results without focusing on, without vulnerability-based trust in those conversations, you have no conflict. And without healthy conflict and having those real conversations, you're never going to make progress on the stuff that matters. Like, think about it. That's just the way the human animal works.
Right.
But when we get in business, all of a sudden we forget the stuff that really matters to us in life. It's not that, one of my mentors, very dear friend of mine, that I actually write a chapter on him in the book, Dr. Joe. He's real simple. Human behavior equal business behavior. And so, part of our culture code and the essence of what we tried to build and what I've worked hard to build is, hey, better people make better business people. So when we welcome climbers into our community, and we focus very intentionally on trying to teach them these things, right? We hire only people who care. That's our acronym. And that's people that are candid, accountable, resourceful, and exceptional. Like that's our acronym for them. And in order to be a great climber in our community, you have to care. But we teach them those behaviors and exactly how we expect them to behave.
Oh,
so that's an example of leading with heart. Teach people the things that matter.
So do you have formal training in the company to teach them that?
We've built our ecosystem to where, over time we've, simplified our welcome, and we have a great team. My vice president of HR, Karen, she's fabulous. She has a phenomenal team that focuses on our welcome and all the human systems that we have around how we select, how we welcome, and then how we develop. And like, there's an example, right? I believe organizations that have a real strong intentional culture do three things better than anyone. They select well, they welcome well, and they develop well. And that's different than hiring, onboarding, and training. So I tell a lot of stories around that and give real examples, when I speak to organizations about the difference that makes in you being able to build the culture that you imagine as a leader.
That is a big difference. That's wonderful. I can imagine you have a lot of happy employees.
Well, I'm blessed. Yes, I'm blessed, but I'm also very intentional about letting them know that we're going to be 17 in September. So technically, that puts us back to our high school years, a sophomore, junior, right?
Yeah.
I didn't have it figured out when I was a sophomore or a junior, right? So we're just fortunate. We're a really big sophomore and junior, but I often tell them that we flunked a lot in those first 5 years. So we're like a big 8th grader. We still have a lot to learn.
Yeah.
And we're avid students of organizations that have built a great culture. I'm real proud of that.
Yeah, well, I'm really proud of you. Because you've done a lot in just 17 years. Your company is quite big.
It's been an interesting journey.
Yeah, so you have about how many employees right now?
So we have a little under between 250, 300 internal climbers, and we have approaching the 10,000 mark of contractors of various classifications across the country working for us at different organizations.
Wow,
it's been an interesting journey. We've learned a lot, and we're going to remain students.
That's wonderful. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations on your new book.
Thank you.
I think, you said it all. Typically, we like to ask about lessons learned and advice, but throughout the entire podcast today, you've given all these tidbits and wonderful advice, and I think the audience has a lot to glean on. So thank you, Bobby, and thank you all for this episode, for coming to listen. We'll be back next Friday, Pacific time, 1 o'clock, and have a great weekend.